Alright, in this video I'll be showing you how to render a single shot using the level sequencer and the movie render queue in Unreal Engine 5. So I do have ray tracing lights on, maybe that matters in the settings if something is not exactly coming out the same way on your end. To get started, I have a scene like this. There's some vegetation, building in the background and some other stuff, and water and hills in the background. Just a simple scene. What you're going to want to have is the movie render queue set up. So you can go to plugins, make sure you have the movie render queue installed in your plugins. Just be sure you check that. These should be already turned on, but in case you don't, make sure you have them turned on and restart. Now, once you turn on the plugin, in case you didn't have it turned on, what you want to do is go to content and probably create a folder for your sequences. I have one called views right here. And what you're going to do is right click and go to cinematics, level sequence. Okay, name this something. I'm going to call it test. Okay, and now I'm double clicking to test and I get my sequencer opening up. Maybe yours just popped open over here or something. I'm just going to place in here and embed it into kind of the bottom of my screen. And then from here, you have nothing turned on. And so you just want to click create a new camera, and that's going to create a cinematic camera for you. So if you look at the outliner, you now have a cine camera actor, and you can see it's tied to the sequencer test. That's the name of our sequencer. So I'm going to right click this and I'm just going to rename it so I'm aware of what this is. So I'm going to call it test camera. So it might have moved it. It moved it down here for me. Okay, so test camera. And from here, you can see I'm in this test camera and it's a similar view in my sequencer. And so before you even set up the camera, the thing you want to do in the sequencer immediately, you can see it's set up to 150 frames. You can just go ahead and grab this and shrink it all the way down to the single frame. Okay, so that's the first thing. You move this image that you just saw me moving. That's the camera. And so then there's this kind of flag over here. You just want to move this to the very beginning. And so now you can't really see anything. It's zoomed in. Go down here to the scroll bar. You could kind of zoom into the frames that we're looking at here. So we're trying to look at frame 0, 0 and 1. That's right here. So you just got to move this scrolly thing around. It's kind of difficult, but here we go. And there we go. So now I'm kind of zoomed in. And what you'll notice is that that image is now shrunk down to the first frame, but you'll see it says 1 of 0. You want to say 1 of 1. And the reason it says 0, otherwise it won't work. You see this little flag, I believe it's the red flag. You want to make sure that that flag, if I just drag it, this one right here, you want to make sure that's set to 1. Right now it's set to 1 of 3. You can see it's by the 3. Move it to 2, and you just want to align it to 1. You got to just make sure you get this to be precise, otherwise it's not going to work. And if you don't cut this down, you're just going to have multiple frames. And if you're rendering something at higher resolution, that's just going to take a very, very long time. I just want one single frame because this is like an architectural visualization image and I don't need a whole animation. From here, we are good to go now to edit our camera. So I'm going to go to test camera over here in the outliner, and I'm going to change my camera settings over here. I'm going to just simply change it to a 35, let's see, super 35. Okay, now you can set this to whatever you like, whatever you think makes sense, but for me, I'm going to select something that is a wide shot. Okay, I want something wide for this landscape shot, and so now I'm going to come down to crop settings. I want to crop it to a 2.39 ratio, and I'm going to move the focal length a little bit back, but something more like this. Go over here, so I'm going to move my camera a little bit, change the aperture, and you can change a lot of settings here. There's a plethora of settings. I'm not really going to get into that. That's not the point of this video. I just want to show you like where you would be able to change that if you want to change it. But these things, the first few things that I changed, is probably something you do want to play around with. Now I'm going to position myself. I've set up a scene around this tree. So I got a rock and I have some grass, and it's usually pretty useful to have, foreground objects like this tree on my side is going to help me frame the shot right here. It's in blur, and you can kind of adjust these motion blurs in the camera settings. So there's also a way of doing it over here. You can override it, this manual distance, the focal distance, so I can just kind of move this around. You can see it gets really blurry or gets really clear, and probably no reason to kind of make it super blurry in the first place. I'm just going to reset that. And so I'm going to try to find a good view. You could press Q on your keyboard to go down or E to go up, kind of find the perfect shot in case you didn't know. So I'm just going to do something like this. I slow down my camera even more. There we go. And so now I try to find the shot, and something like this is fine. I do have something weird on my left-hand side here. I probably want to take care of that. But again, this is not a video about composing an image. I just kind of want to set something up. Again, having some grass, some plants, and some rocks and trees in the foreground is a good setup in this case. Lighting is fine in this case as well, but in case you want to change it, you can obviously click Control L. Okay, find the best light for your scene and go ahead and render that. So something like this is actually interesting, but I'm just going to go back to what I had before. In perspective, I'm going to change this to cinematic viewport. All that does is it gives me this viewport right here. Now, when I did that, it took me out of my test camera. So you want to just go back to test camera, and now you see that it tells me the information that I'm at the Super 35 zoom at 20.43 millimeters. I just like to know that this information is here. That's why I set the camera to cinematic viewport first, then you do test camera. Okay, moving on, let's set up the scene. Whenever you set up your scene and you're ready to go, all you want to do is click this render button here. Now, if you click the three dots, you'll see that there's a render movie queue or the movie scene capture. This is the legacy. I'll talk about this in a second, but what you really want is the movie render queue. So just click this button over here. Okay, and so what you want to do is you want to go to render and you're going to select your sequence. Now that we're dealing with test, so I'm going to click test over here. Okay, and you have a settings, you have an output, and you have this pipeline. The pipeline, it should be matched the level that you're in. The name of my level is E17, so whatever your level is, make sure that's set, otherwise it won't work as well. From here, you're going to want to control this by turning it on or off. Now I'll explain this in a little bit, but you want to keep it on. Go to settings, okay, and then from here you're going to have, let's say, a preset. I think still, draft, and ultra are the just default settings. I have one that I created. I'll explain this in a second. Make sure you're just on draft for now. You just want to make sure that your rendering works. So I've found out that this doesn't always work. If you go to output, you want to save this to a folder of your choosing. In my case, I'm going to go to a folder called view, and I'm just going to click accept. And then from here, I'm just going to go ahead and render. Just make sure your output is in the folder that you want so you know where to find it. All right, that little window right there that flashed real quick, that was the rendering. If I load up that image, it's this image right here. It seems like it's working. Basically, my landscape is showing up over here. Sometimes I get an error and the landscape disappears. Now, if you get an issue like this where your landscape and everything disappears, there is a fix to it that I found. Sometimes it just fixes itself, but one way I found to fix it is if you change this back to the movie scene capture, okay, instead of the movie render queue, click this right here, click the button, and just go capture movie and then save selected. It's just going to ask you to save everything. It will give you a preview similar to the movie render queue, and in that case it will show you your landscape. At least it did for me when I tried fixing it. Then you just close that. That's not very important, and you only do this if your landscape isn't showing up and you had the issue that I previewed, which is something like this. If you don't have that issue, or if you had that issue and you fixed it, go back to the movie render queue, and now we're going to go ahead and set up our settings. Here I'm going to go ahead and create a new output over here, and so they're both from the same sequencer test. I'm going to turn this one off. What you want to do is create a custom setting here, and so in my case I have one that's called 2:3:9 ratio. The reason I have this 2.39 ratio is because my output is going to be at that ratio, right? Okay, so you want to find a website that shows you the references of the ratios to the resolution in pixels that you want to output to. For example, I was using a 2.39 ratio as I was selecting my camera, so if I want a 4K image at that ratio, this is the number that I want to plug in into my output. Now, if you want to do 3K, 2K, 8K, whatever, you just want to follow the chart like this, and I'll link this in the descriptions below. But you want to follow a chart like this to know what your actual resolution is to match the camera view. Otherwise, you're going to get something that doesn't quite match your output. The number that I found on that chart for a 4K image at the ratio that I have is this number right here. All I have to do is just plug that in. And then in here, there's not much you really want to mess around with. The only other thing I would say is your output directory, but I discussed this earlier. You just pick the folder you want to output to. Now, I don't want to use a JPEG. I want to use a PNG. So you just come up to settings. If I didn't have it already pre-selected, you have exports over here. And so you just select PNG from this selection over here. I'm just going to turn that on. I want PNG. I don't want a JPEG. I just want PNG. And then you want to turn on anti-aliasing. That's over here again. Go to settings and find anti-aliasing. So spatial sample count is 1, temporal sample count is 8, and then everything else just kind of leave like this. Another thing you probably want to have is, well, this is usually turned on. This is how I have it set up. Okay, nothing special. And then you want to turn on some console variables. It's just going to help you get the best type of rendering outputted from your movie render queue. Now, I did find this from some, YouTube wizards and Unreal Engine. It's not something I necessarily found on my own. I will be linking these in the descriptions below, but the first one is an ambient inclusion denoiser. After that is global illumination, and then reflections denoiser, and then we have shadows denoiser, temporal accumulation, and then a temporal AA upsampling. I'll be linking these in the descriptions below or typing them out. Okay, so just make sure you set these all to 0 as well, and then you should be good to go. So this is the settings that I set up. You just want to go ahead and save it. So I'm going to go ahead and save as, and I just saved it in my general content browser. Maybe it makes sense to save it where your views are, but nonetheless, just be sure you save that. So I'm going to go ahead and click accept and make sure it's set to that ratio. If there's a star right here, that means it's not saved. Again, make sure your map is set correctly. Now I'm going to click render local and see what I get. Now this will take a while, so just sit there and let it load. And here's like the preview. It's currently just rendering through the passes, and it kind of looks blurry, but once it outputs, it will look pretty high resolution depending on the pixel count that you set it to. But again, this will take some time depending on your computer and the hardware you have. The outputted rendering looks something like this. If I zoom in, you could tell, oh, there's quite a bit of resolution. And so this is pretty much it to create a single frame. And if you want to create another view, you could just go back to here and go to content browser, and I'm going to create another sequencer. Go to cinematics, level sequencer, call this, I'm just going to call it 2. And so in here, I'm going to open it up and I'm going to create a new camera. I'm just going to move it over here so we know it's slightly different. And now I'm going to go ahead and go to my movie render queue. Okay, and right now I'm going to go to render and I'm going to find 2. That's the second sequencer. I'm going to keep it to this still draft, and I'm going to turn off this because that took a long time. Turn on the draft mode. And so you can turn these on so you have multiple at the same time. This pipeline over here is going to basically export out both of these. So if I go ahead and click render local, I'm going to get both test and 2 because they're both turned on. If I just want number 2, then I turn this off. Okay, that's how this works. So you can have multiple renderings coming out at the same exact time. That's what's kind of nice about this, pretty powerful. But I would recommend just doing one at a time and definitely testing with drafts before you go up to the high resolution. And again, making sure that your landscape is showing up. So if I go ahead and test this out, there we go. All right, and just one thing to notice is that because I did this really quick, you notice that it's rendering out 150 frames. Be sure you're aware of how many frames you set it to. You got to do that very first step where you shrink it down to just one single frame, because you do not want this rendering 150 times. If you just want one image, I'm not animating this, there's no point to have 150 frames. It's just going to be 150 images of the same exact thing. Hopefully you learned a thing or two, and if you have any questions, do let me know in the comments below. See you on the next one.